when you start looking at questions of human rights, there are certain words that keep coming up all the time. So words like dignity, equality, freedom, respect, liberty, security, privacy, tolerance, friendship, and understanding. And it's these kinds of values, values that are embodied in these words, that are central to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations as long ago as the 10th of December 1948. And remember, this is after the Second World War, when there were all sorts of real issues between people. Obviously it was a very pertinent time to bring in these kinds of discussions. And there are various, like all these conventions and declarations, it's divided into a number of sections or articles, okay? So an article is just a section within the document. But I think it's important for us to note that, these two things in particular, it says that everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. So in other words, you can say, this is my culture, okay? And also, the other article here says that everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he or she is the author. So in other words, I own it. And there's a nice link here, I think, to the first slide that Kate showed the other day. Remember the one which had that little sign on that said no photography? Okay, so this links in very, very nicely to this idea of the Convention on Declaration on Human Rights. Because here what we're seeing is that any scientific, literary, or artistic production, so that might be a way of dress or a dance or a song, there's questions of ownership. Who owns it? Whose responsibility is it to work with that kind of material? And as you saw in Kate's case, there was a group there who were very, very keen to indicate that, look, this is our property. It's not yours. You can come and see this performance. You can come and see us wearing traditional dress, but don't take any photographs because it's our property. It isn't yours. This idea of human rights and cultural diversity is really interesting because, again, this gives us a nice link really into what Christina was saying the other day, that human values aren't universal and they vary a great deal according to cultural perspectives. And if you remember, Christina explained this idea of cultural relativism to us. So this cartoon really, it's a bit naughty, but it does sort of indicate very nicely what this means. So I don't know if you're aware of the concept of life drawing, which is if you're training to be an artist, you have to learn how to draw the human figure. So this is really looking at two different takes on that from a different cultural perspective. And as we've addressed before, there are certain cultural practices that fail to respect human rights, and we referred to a number of those the other morning. And those things sort of give us real problems, okay? So stoning someone to death might be a cultural practice, but it violates all our ideas of human rights, okay? So what the UN Declaration states is that where cultural tradition alone governs a state's compliance with international standards, then widespread abuse, disregard, and violation of human rights can be given legitimacy. So in other words, you can say that, well, it's our culture, we do this is what we do in our society. But in fact, attempts to justify such violations on the basis of culture alone have got no validity under international law. So you can see that there's something of a problem, an issue here for us, something of a paradox that we have to deal with. And people are clearly different, and we are kept, if you like, in our own particular cultural cages. But this doesn't mean to say that we can't get out of them and talk to one another from time to time. So again, this is something about universal rights. They don't impose one cultural standard, but what they do is give you one legal standard of minimum protection necessary for human dignity. Let's move on to this issue of cultural rights, and they're different. And they're different because human rights are vested in the individual, whereas cultural rights is about groups of people, okay? So cultural rights tend to focus on groups such as religious and ethnic minorities or indigenous societies that are threatened, okay? And when we're talking about cultural rights, it's quite interesting that this idea of indigenous intellectual property rights comes up very, very strongly. And in fact, the first time really that this came, I think, to people's wider attention was at a conference which was subsequently became known as the Earth Summit, which took part in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1992. And the reason indigenous intellectual property rights came to the fore then was that because of the significance of traditional cultural knowledge to the protection of biodiversity. So in other words, things like knowledge about ethnomedicine, plant identification and cultivation, using sustainable harvesting practices, so fishing in a way that doesn't actually harm the whole stock of the fishes that you're wanting to harvest. Knowledge of that kind is really important, and that's embedded in indigenous cultural communities. So what we see here then is something which as I mentioned to you, I'm quite interested in. These connections between nature and culture. And we saw it yesterday, remember, at the Hmong village? We talked a lot there about how those local people had traditionally worked with materials from the forest in which they lived for their survival. So there's this, very, very strong connection between people and nature. And this little cartoon here shows, if you like, nature imprisoned, nature as a prisoner to mankind, with a shackle around this plant. And more recently, certainly in the academic press, we've seen a lot of references emerging to something which is theoretically new and which has been termed biocultural conservation. But this is an indication that if you're going to preserve biodiversity, if you're going to preserve wildlife, and if you're going to preserve culture, these two things have got to go hand in hand. They've actually got to work together to be effective. Let me briefly mention then this International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which was written and agreed in 1976. And again, this sort of recognises the right of everyone to participate in cultural life, but it's targeted at individuals rather than cultural groups, and it doesn't say anything about IPR, intellectual property rights. And I was interested to know what Thailand's view of this. Well, it signed the covenant, but it interprets the right to self-determination within the framework of other international laws. So yes, okay, we'll be a part of it, but we'll give our own natural take on this, and we'll work with it in a way that is appropriate for our country. You don't hear very much about it because I don't think it's a very strong piece of legislation.